Hi guys, welcome to my second webcast. This one's the Nile in early Egypt. I say it's mine, but we all know it's Mr. Jacobson's. So anyway, most of this is review tonight, but some of it will be new, so I definitely want you to pay attention to the parts that you haven't read yet in your book. Okay, here's just kind of a map of the whole area. Over here we have Mesopotamia, which we already have been studying. Here we have the first ancient civilization of Sumer. We studied about the Sargon of Akkad, Assur, and the mighty Assyrians. And then, of course, we have the Hittites here. So we've got the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers underneath the whole little fertile crescent under here, right? Then now we're going to jump over here west to Egypt. There should be things here you already recognize. The main attraction would be the Nile River and its delta right here, which flows into the Mediterranean. We got the Red Sea here a little bit to the right. And then obviously the whole big surrounding desert. Okay, so this here, we talked about this today, the river. If it wasn't for the Nile River, nobody would ever have settled in Egypt. And we would not have so many of the things that we have today. So because the Nile existed, it created all this fertile land, right? On both sides of the riverbank, allowing for families to stop and to farm and really set up their civilizations. Here's a closer look at the whole area. Here, of course, we have the delta again, and this all down here, this is called the Nile River Valley. Okay, and all this green is all the fertile land that is created from the Nile River's flooding. Here we have the Western Desert, right? The Eastern Desert. So like I just said, this is all super, super important because without this, we would not have this rich history from Egypt. We wouldn't have the story of the pharaohs. We wouldn't have the pyramids. We wouldn't have the Sphinx. We wouldn't really have, their culture. It just never would have existed, which to me seems a little bit crazy. Okay, so here we have a very famous quote. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. I don't know who said it though. Somebody important, or else it wouldn't be in quotes. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. So like we've been talking about in class and like I've already said in the webcast, without the Nile, we wouldn't have anything pertaining to Egypt. We wouldn't have any of the wonders of the world that we have. None of that would exist. Because of the Nile and all this fertile land, see all the green that it created, that allowed the Egyptians to set up their civilizations and really create the most amazing culture that they did. So it is a gift to the world, really, from the Nile River. So we already talked about it's one big giant desert, really. This part doesn't look too deserty, right? Because it's not, because this is, where the Nile overflows and floods and creates all the super fertile soil. But it really didn't get very much rainfall. And so they really relied on the Nile for everything. They relied on it for cooking and cleaning and fishing and bathing and all the things that we talked about this morning. It's about 4,000 miles long. A lot of people say it's the longest river in the world, but I read something that said in 2009 they remeasured and the Amazon beat out the Nile by something like 64 miles. I'm sorry, that's the bell. Something like 64 miles. But some people say that the Nile is the longest river, and some people say the Amazon is the longest river. So either way, it's in the top 2 in the entire world. Along the Nile, there are narrow cliffs and boulders called cataracts. Okay, so here's another map. And this map shows the desert, right? We got the whole desert and everything. Here we have the delta again with the little branches flowing into the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Red Sea over here to the right. As you go down, actually up the Nile River, because the river flows this direction. It flows from south to north. And as you are moving down the river, it seems opposite, but this is down. Here we have the 6th cataract. Here we have the 5th cataract, the 4th, the 3rd, the 2nd, and the 1st. And the cataracts were super significant for reasons hopefully you already know. So here's a photo of the Nile River, obviously where there are no cataracts. It looks quite lovely, right? You can see a little bit the water's moving. Probably quite enjoyable to hang out and spend the day there. Now here we have actually a photo of a cataract, and you can see how it's all rocky and cliffy and forms kind of these waterfalls. Okay, so the cataract means fast rapids. So if people floated both up and down the Nile River. They went in both directions. They could go downriver towards the Mediterranean Sea because that's, the current took them that way. And then the wind, though, blew north to south, and so the wind could actually blow them upriver. And so think about this in terms of trading. Like, it would be very difficult if you were in this area and having to try to trade with another gnome. But in this area, trading by boat would actually be, just fine. No problems at all. Okay, so trading on the Nile. So within Egypt, people use the Nile for trade and transportation. Winds from the north pushed the sailboats south, so we just said that. And the flow of the Nile carried them north. So they went south to north because the land in the south was actually higher. And water flows downhill. So there was a higher elevation in the south where the white and the blue Nile met. And that was the current went towards the Mediterranean Sea. But the wind blew in the opposite direction. The villages from Egypt, they had a lot of contact with one another in terms of trade. It was friendly, unlike the way it was in Mesopotamia city-states. They were always fighting and conquering and taking and charging. Here, there was more like, we have some barley. Hey, you want some flaxseed? Okay, let's trade. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the river people. There was regular flooding in the Nile River, right? There we go. The flooding was more dependable and gentle with the Nile, different than the Euphrates and the Tigris. It usually flooded in the spring. The heavy rains came from Africa and the melting snow. Oh, sorry, they came from Central Africa and the melting snow from East Africa, adding to the water level in the Nile. They kind of flooded between July and October. Further down the river, it flooded kind of later. So higher up, where the elevation was higher, it started flooding earlier, and then it took time to kind of get down the river because it's such a big long river. It doesn't all flood at exactly the same time everywhere. And it left behind a layer of dark fertile mud, which they called Kemet, the black land, right? And so that black land was a good thing. So how did the Egyptians use the Nile? Okay, they planted wheat, barley, and flax seeds. They used it for irrigation. They dug the basins in the earth to trap the flood water. They also dug canals to carry the water to their fields. And then now we're getting into the newer part. So what were hieroglyphics? So the Egyptian writing system was made of thousands of picture symbols, okay? Similar to cuneiform, but not quite the same. A few people could read and write. A few men went to a special school to study and become scribes. So very similar to Mesopotamia in that sense. Here's a picture of some hieroglyphs. Okay, so here's a picture just of some hieroglyphs. Okay, moving on. Okay, so the Nile River irrigation system, right, consisted of basin trap floodwaters. We talked about that. The big ditch that would hold and trap in all the water when the river would flow so they'd have the water for later when they needed it. The dike that strengthened the basin so they would stop the water flow and then they could kind of control where the water went to make it kind of steer it into their basins. And then the canals to carry the water to the fields, right? And the shadoofs, which they used to place the water in the basins, right? So that was a way for them to extract water out of the river that was easier because water is not so easy to manage. So here is a picture. I love this picture. I don't know why I love it so much, but I do. Of a guy getting the water out of the river using the totally cool contraption, the shadoof. Okay, so this here actually is probably a river basin because it's difficult to get the water out of the Nile, right, to get that close. So here out of the water basin, they have the super cool shadoof. And so they have this bucket sort of thing attached to the rope, attached to the pole. And this here is like a heavy counterbalance, right? So this is super heavy. And so what that does, instead of him having to lift that out, he lifts it just a little bit. And so this weight, kind of like a teeter-totter, you know, it is so heavy it pulls down and then helps lift the water up so he can put the water in the canisters and then take them back where he needs them. Okay, here we have some canals, right? This is another cool picture. And then these here are the dikes, the mounds of dirt that are actually like controlling where the water is going to flow. Okay, so here's a painting from ancient Egypt of a guy, right, using his shadoof. It's kind of cool. So you have the bucket, the rope, and looks like he's actually, this is a branch, of course, right? And then here's your counterbalance back here. So it's kind of interesting and neat. Okay, so here is a slide of some hieroglyphs. The hieroglyphs eventually turned into an alphabet, right? They kind of evolved over time. Cuneiform or cuneiform did not evolve into an alphabet. It was still symbols, but the hieroglyphic alphabet or hieroglyphs, they did evolve into actual symbols or pictures representing specific letters. So the rise of government. The advances in the farming, the crafts, and trade created a need for government in Egypt, just like in Mesopotamia. The irrigation systems had to be built and maintained, and surplus grain had to be stored and passed out in times of need. So all of a sudden, jobs are being created, right? As things are happening and their civilization is growing, there's a need for somebody to take care of the irrigation system. There's somebody to take care of the surplus grain. Who's going to keep track of it? Who's going to pass it out? And so eventually the government emerges, right? A government is formed to plan and direct all these activities. So as more technological type things like the shadoof and the dikes and all this stuff is being created and thought of, it's making their civilization far more complex, and therefore different needs are coming out of that. And the main need would be the government. Okay, so Egypt was eventually divided into two kingdoms. By 4000 BC, this all happened. So here you have the delta. That was considered, this area was considered Lower Egypt. And then upriver from that, this was all Upper Egypt. So remember I told you before that the river flows south to north. Okay, water flows downhill. So the elevation of all of this area here is far higher than the elevation here in Lower Egypt. And so that's the reason why they call it Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. So the land here is higher than the land here, so it's lower. And so this is upriver, right? The water's flowing this way, so it makes sense upriver, right? If they were going against the current, they would be going this way, which they could actually go because the winds blew in this direction, right? So they could actually go upriver, which is unusual, but the winds were so strong that let them do that. So here you have Upper Egypt, this area, and Lower Egypt is really just this, you know, section kind of right in here. It cuts off right there. Okay, next slide. Which one is it? Sorry, I'm lost for a second. Here we go. There we go. All right. Okay, so as I look at this, I see I'm missing like some little information here. So here's the leader of Upper Egypt. Here's the white crown that the leader wore. And then here, this should say Lower Egypt crown. This is the red one, is the Lower Egypt crown. Okay, so these guys both in 4000 BC were in charge of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay, so eventually, Upper and Lower Egypt get unified under this guy here, Narmer. He was the king of both Upper of Upper Egypt, and then he conquered Lower Egypt, so then he was the king of both. So this was the very first time in history that Egypt was unified. In order to signify unity and strength, what he did was he combined the two crowns, and so it was called the double crown of Egypt. So here you have the white section, which is the upper crown of Egypt, and then you have the red part, which was represented the lower crown, or the lower part of Egypt. So this is called here the double crown of Egypt. Okay, and Narmer is the pharaoh, the first guy to conquer them. So here's another picture. Here's the first part. This is your Upper Egypt part crown. Here's your Lower Egypt. And then here they are together. Okay, so here's a stone carving of Narmer. You see he's wearing his Upper Egypt crown. He's got a scepter in his hand, and he's holding this guy by his hair, and he's getting ready to kill him. In one way or another, he's either going to hit him in the head, break his neck. I don't know. It's not very nice. But in order to conquer Lower Egypt, right, that's kind of how things went down back then. So here is an artist's interpretation. I'm sorry my picture is so small, but I already started this, so I can't make it bigger. But here's an artist's interpretation of the same picture, or the same carving. So here he has his scepter. He's wearing his crown. Here's this guy. You've got fire back here. A lot of bad things happening. We got some dead guys. So this is the reality, the gruesome reality of Narmer conquering, or uniting, I guess. I mean, he's conquering Lower Egypt in order to unite them both. Okay, last slide. Okay, so Narmer, he moved his So Narmer, here we have like our Lower Egypt, right, and our Upper Egypt. So remember, he united both of them by conquering Lower Egypt. So he moved his capital to Memphis on the border of both Upper and Lower Egypt. So here's where his capital was. So when he was in charge of Upper Egypt, his capital was here at Thebes. But think about it. So he's now in charge of all of this. He's ruling all of this. So if there's some kind of revolt from the Lower Egypt guys not wanting to follow Narmer and what his men are saying, it's going to be really difficult for him to get all the way down here and stop the uprising. So what he did was he moved from Thebes to Memphis so that he would be more kind of in between the two areas and closer to Lower Egypt, so that he could keep track of their behavior and make sure they weren't, trying to revolt or do something bad. After he died, Narmer, his family continued to rule. This is called a dynasty. And after that, there's just this really long ruling in Egypt, over 30 different dynasties. So that kind of just indicates how powerful Egypt was during the ancient civilization times, that they held power of this area for an entire 30 dynasties. Okay, so that's it. Hopefully you learned something new, and maybe just kind of some of the other stuff that you already knew is a little bit more solidified in your brain. All right, I'll see you later. Ciao.